Greetings, heroes. It is great to see you. I am here for a live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show podcast. And today's topic is about the, let's say, LGBTQ and the Jewish community. So for people who identify as an L or a G or a B or a T or a Q or an I or an A or just plain folks, I get a lot of questions about from people who describe themselves this way, saying, "Do I fit into the Jewish community?" I get a lot of people. I get some questions from people who don't describe themselves this way, asking me, "What does Judaism say about these people who are in my community?" And because I've been getting so many questions lately, let me get my phone out of my pocket. Because I've been getting so many questions about this lately, I decided to make a live video about this topic. So I would love it if people who are joining me can jump into the chat. Let me know what's your name, where are you coming from. Love to give some shout outs here. This is once again a live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show, which is a podcast, which means the video is not going to go out, but people might hear this in their earbuds. And I'm going to tell you, this video makes me a little bit nervous. And not because I have any kind of nervousness around the issue of homosexuality or around people who are LGBTQIA or folks. That gives me no discomfort whatsoever. My discomfort about the topic is that I am not one of this community. And so there are people out there who I think are better teachers to talk about this. I want to apply some humility and modesty here. There are some incredible gay rabbis, lesbian rabbis, trans rabbis, queer rabbis, bisexual rabbis who can speak not only to the Jewish law and current denominational positions about the status of these folks in our communities, but also have the lived experience to share. One thing that's been wonderful for me is to share my lived experience as a Jew, as a rabbi, as a person who converted to Judaism, as kind of an example or just a real life example for people out there who learn from me. And talking about this takes me a little bit out of that comfort zone. I am a Caucasian, cis, male, privileged in every way in the community. So I can't, I have to acknowledge that. Like, I can't speak to the lived experience that people are living with today. And I want to be humble about that. And I want to be transparent about that. However, because people are asking me these questions, I feel obligated to answer them as best I can with the understanding between you and me that I don't have lived experience in this regard. I can only tell you how I feel around people who are gay, about having gay people in Jewish communities. I can only tell you my read on the Jewish law as far as that is concerned. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to, I'll say, take a stand, just because it's so important to me that people who learn with me know where I stand on this issue. And I may, at the end of this video, lose a lot of subscribers or maybe gain a couple of subscribers. I hate to say this, I don't really care. It's not that I don't care about subscribers. I love us learning together. I am indifferent as to whether this gains or loses me people in my audience. I think it's really important that you know where I stand on this, and then you decide whether we can continue learning together in this regard. So just wanted to put that out front, a little bit of disclaimer. This is talking about LGBTQIA and folks in the Jewish community, how different Jewish communities perceive that, accept that, don't accept that. I will give you what I know. I will share my view on the Jewish law in this regard and tell you where I'm coming from as a rabbi and sort of let you decide where to go from there. We'll recommend maybe some other resources for you and make this pledge here, live, public, that I'm going to try to do a better job of getting rabbis and leaders and teachers who are a part of this community onto the Jew Curious Show to share their experience with my Jew Curious audience. So that's what we're talking about today. That's my pledge to you. And let's jump into the chat and see what's going on here. Let's see. We've got Autumn is coming in from Arizona. We got Hickey Girl Steph. We got Teresa from Cyprus. Felipe Lima from Brazil. I think I saw you yesterday. Welcome back, Felipe. We got CJ Mays. Olaf from Delaware. All right, Delaware's in the house. CJ Mays says, something I haven't fully understood is why some rabbis, conservative, are hesitant to consider, excuse me, I had a little cough in my throat there. Let me back up. Again, this is a live studio recording, which means I can edit out whatever I like later. But you get the full blooper reel here. So CJ says, something I haven't fully understood is why some rabbis, in parentheses, conservative, are hesitant to consider LGBT marriages, kiddushin, or use words like according to the laws of Moses in wedding ceremonies. I'm really glad you brought that up. I hope we'll get to that today. Somebody named Tanya, halacha is very clear against it. How do we reconcile that with our support for the LGBTQIA, or IA, it's a lot of letters, plus community? Thank you for raising that. And we'll take a look at the halacha of that. I agree with you that there is a lot of halacha that is very clear on this issue. I won't say it is uniform. And there have been some moves within halacha lately that I think have done our community a service. So Vanessa's here from Germany. We got Bud Rod, Georgia in the house. We've got John from Houston, Texas. All right, another Texan and another John. I always like that. So thank you guys for chiming in today. Really glad to see you again. For people who are just joining us, I'm going to say I am excited to talk about this topic, to share my views on this topic. I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about it because I want to make it clear that this is not my lived experience, and so it's a little bit out of my comfort zone in that regard. But homosexuality, LGBTQIA plus people do not make me uncomfortable at all, and I'm hoping that this will actually expand some people's perception of the Jewish community and help them feel more welcome. So that's a little bit tipping my hand to my stand as it is. So this is, God willing, going to be episode 36 of the Jew Curious show. And that means you'll be able to find the show notes on this at jewcurious.show/episode 36. So in the future, when this is out, this will be jewcurious.show/episode 36. We've only got about episode 30 in the wild right now, so it's going to be a little bit, but God willing, we'll do some good learning today that we can share with some other people, with the promise to do additional learning with some guests that I'm trying to get on the show right now. So we have Thomas from Utah, Daniel from Fort Worth. Good to see you, Daniel. I think I've seen you in the community. Really glad to have you here, buddy. So let's go. I guess what I'll start with, maybe I should start with the intro stuff for the podcast. Again, this is a live studio recording of a podcast, so I've got to record some of that radio announcer-y kind of voice to share. And so let's do that. Let's see, how should I start this? I usually start with the word hero. Have you wondered about how people from the LGBTQIA plus folks community fit into the Jewish community? On today's show, we will be talking about this, looking at a number of different legal perspectives, as well as social perspectives and the opinions of various movements within Judaism, right after this bass. All right, that's where my bass drum comes in, and so let's do this. What I can say, let's see, maybe I'm trying to decide whether I want to just go right into a Q&A or make my own personal feelings known. That's good radio. Let's say, I think I'm just going to start with how I feel personally and where I am coming from. So right up front, I want to say that if you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, there's a new word I learned recently, folks, which I understand broadens the spectrum a little bit because some of those other letters imply some sort of gender binary that isn't necessarily accurate. Wherever you fit in this spectrum, I understand that you have probably encountered religious communities that made you feel like you didn't belong. It's entirely possible you have encountered Jewish communities that made you feel like you didn't belong on either, I'll say, religious grounds, by pointing at a verse in the Torah, or just social mores and not making you feel accepted. Where I come from, where I stand on this, is that anybody anywhere can learn Torah, can learn how to grow as a person, how to improve their relationships with other people, how to experience a life of greater meaning and joy. And I do mean anyone, anywhere. And so first off, never feel uncomfortable learning about Jewish stuff with me on the basis of your sexual identity, however you describe that. So that's where I'm coming from. And this is an issue that I've thought about quite a bit as a rabbi coming into a community, this is an issue that I've thought about quite a bit as a rabbi coming into a movement or a denomination within Judaism that I love very much, that has very much supported my Jewish journey, that is still, I'm going to say, working stuff out in its acceptance of queer people. And so I came into this knowing that, okay, I've never had any kind of bias. I can't recall ever having any kind of bias against people because they were gay. I grew up in the rural South. And I'm not saying that there were no gay people in the rural South. It's just that they weren't maybe out, or they weren't as apparent. They were shunned for a variety of reasons. And so maybe felt like keeping it on the down low. I don't know. But this wasn't something I was exposed to a lot as a child. However, it's something that I became more and more aware of as I became more mature, and it baffled me the way, let's say, racism baffled me growing up in a place that part of the culture was deeply racist. I didn't understand how that could work. I also didn't understand how people could use religion to reinforce that prejudice. And so when I became aware of the issues, the struggles, the identity of people who were gay, lesbian, however you want to call it, how people would use religion to reinforce those prejudices. I was quickly instructed that, hey, there's a verse in the Bible, in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, a man shall not lie with a man as a man would with a woman. And then hanging on that one verse, an entire architecture of prejudice and bigotry and pushing people out of the community. And so that's true in other religions as well, but it's also present within Judaism. What I have been gratified and overjoyed to see is how the conservative movement of Judaism that I'm a part of, and I know the Reform movement was much more expansive, tolerant, welcoming, open, accepting, and celebrating than way before the conservative movement was. That's like, I have less experience over there. But I was glad to see that when I decided to come to rabbinical school, it was I'll say the year after the first year that my school accepted the first openly gay candidate for starting rabbinical school for ordination. There have always been gay Jews. There have always been gay rabbis. And yet, because of this verse, and because of the buildup of halakha around this verse, people have thought, well, we'd love to embrace all of our brothers and sisters, etc. But how can we square that with a halakha? And Tanya asked that question earlier. How do we square this with the law? To cut to the chase, I am totally satisfied with how we have squared that with the law at this point. I believe it was 2006, the Conservative Movement's Law Committee, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, came out with a number of legal positions on this issue, not entirely for, not entirely against, or what have you, but came out with a number of different legal statements. And I've picked the one that is most legally sound to me, as well as the most humane for people who are created in the image of God. And that's the position that I take. I'll get into some more details about that later, but I just want to make it very clear up front that your sexual preference, your sexual identity, or asexual identity as the case may be, does not preclude you from doing Jewish learning and living a complete Jewish life, or bar you from any community on any legal basis that I can see. And I can't speak for every community. I know there are going to be a lot of people who disagree with me about this, a lot of rabbis who disagree with me about this, a lot of Stam Yidden, a lot of Christian folks, Muslim folks, etc., who disagree with me about this, but I wanted you to know where I'm coming from so that you can decide whether we can keep learning together. That decision for us to not learn together will not come from me on this basis. So I hope that's clear And I want to go to the chats for a little second because I think this is something people are going to be passionate about. And I'll say if you're I'll just preface this. I haven't read one yet, but I'll say if you're just coming in here to hate on folks, I'm not going to dignify your statement with repeating it over the air. Let's see. We got Daniel from Fort Worth, Thomas from Utah. Shalom. What do you think about homosexuality? This person's chiming in from Paris. Let's see. Daniel brings up a great point. My Christian family says that the homosexual issue is straightforward in the Old Testament. I've heard that it mostly speaks to temple prostitutes and not to LGBTQ individuals. So I'm just going to throw. I don't want to chide anybody, but one thing that kind of rubs me the wrong way, I'll say, is people who, whether they're Jewish or Christian or whatever, take a look at the Old Testament, and you've heard me talk about that before. We just call it the Testament. Thank you very much. How people take a look at the book of Leviticus and say, yep, it says no gay people or no gay behavior, so the Bible said it, that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to be like, okay, well, you're going to clean all the bacon out of your fridge now, right? Because the Old Testament said that too. Are you honoring your parents right now? You feel good about honoring your parents? Because that was in the top 10. Right. And so that people have taken this, or let me say it a different way. It is clear to me that there is more to play. It is clear to me that there is more at play here than just the Bible said it. So, we got to do it. And I'm going to suggest and even say forthright that people are taking their own prejudices and picking a verse in the Bible to reinforce those prejudices. And I know that because there's lots of stuff in the Bible that it says to do that people have let go by the wayside. Religious people have let go by the wayside, right? It also says, let's kill people for gathering sticks on Shabbat. It also says that you shouldn't eat animals that weren't killed in a certain ritual fashion. It says that you shouldn't mix milk and meat together. And so the idea of somebody, and then I'm going to call out a place that I remember loving. If you are eating at a Whataburger in Texas and you are eating a cheeseburger and then opening a Bible and saying, Bible says no gay stuff, that's how we have to be, that is ridiculous to me. And if you come back and say that, well, the New Testament abrogates things like kashrut and things like Shabbat restrictions, but it doesn't abrogate Leviticus 18:22, which I'll get to in a second, that I think is a total misread anyway, then that just seems like you're picking and choosing among the things in the Bible that reinforce your own prejudices. And so I'm less convinced by that argument. So let's see. Would the sexuality of one individual be questioned during an approach for a conversion process? If so, would a movement say no to a convert based on that and only that information? So I'll say this. I can't speak for any other movement legally besides the conservative movement. My understanding is that the Reform movement has for a long time supported the equality of LGBTQIA and folks. And so that I don't think if you were in and again, this is just my hypothesis, I don't think that would bar you from converting as a Jew in the Reform movement. I'm going to say 99% sure that will not bar you from conversion in the conservative movement. And the only reason I'm leaving out that 1%, I know that my Beit Din wouldn't behave that day, or rather the Beit Din that I sit on from time to time. I can't speak for every conservative Beit Din out there, especially because there has been a bit of a rift within the conservative movement on this issue between people who are more egalitarian, first off, just treating women and men equally as human beings. But I imagine this is part of that rift as well. So I can't say 100% of the time that the conservative movement will accept somebody, but I know that the Beit Din that I sit on, that never comes up, right? And I'll say that's not on a list of questions that we ask. And if we did ask that and the answer was yes, I'm gay, that's not dispositive. We're more interested in, are you sincere about becoming Jewish? Are you sure that you're letting go of any other religious connections that you had? That's really what we're looking for. We're not checking other things like that. So That's what I can say. I cannot speak at all for Orthodox Batei Din. I can't speak at all for how Orthodox rabbis might answer that question. And so you would have to ask an Orthodox rabbi for that. Let's see. Somebody shares with another member in the community. So somebody asks, is halacha against it though? Because I have seen some conservative rabbi dissent saying the prohibition on same-sex intimacy should not hold if we are to truly if we are truly to respect the dignity of persons. So this is a great way to kind of intro into the tshuvot that I was talking about earlier. When I say tshuvot, that's plural of tshuva, which often we talk about on this channel, tshuva as a kind of repentance or self-improvement. There's another meaning of the word tshuva, which is a legal responsum, right? This is a statement made by a rabbi or a team of rabbis working together saying, here is a legal position we take on a question that we've been asked that it might not be obvious from the Talmud or the Shulchan Aruch, because let's say we didn't have, when the Shulchan Aruch came out, we didn't have microwaves back then, or cars, or Uber, or the internet at all. And so as new things have developed in society, then we've answered those things not by writing additional codes, but by taking them case by case and coming up with these legal position papers. Not that homosexuality was invented recently, but for a long time it was sort of assumed in the halakhic literature that this was not something that Judaism endorsed, accepted, promoted, etc. However, after decades, or after I'll say millennia, if not longer, then the conservative movement took this issue up in the early part of the last decade. And in 2006, I believe, there were 3 different tshuvot that came out. And how this is a little inside baseball, how the conservative movement decides law is they don't, from the top of the mountain, from the law committee in New York, say, here's one way, everybody has to do it. Instead, rabbis take a look at an issue. They form a well thought out opinion and a paper on that issue, and they put it up for a vote among the law committee. And then the law committee just votes and says, not is this right or is this wrong, but is this a valid legal argument? And what that means is that on one particular issue, 2 different rabbis or groups of rabbis can come up with a legal position that oppose one another. However, they can both be accepted by the conservative movement as valid legal arguments. And then it is up to the Mar Da'atra, the local rabbi of a particular community, to say, how are we going to do things in this community? And so the law committee came up with 3 different positions. And then that challenged rabbis of particular synagogues, schools, online schools, YouTube channels, what have you, to say, okay, which of these arguments am I convinced by? And that's how we're going to do things in my community. There was one position, and I don't want to gloss over it or misinterpret it, so I want to make sure, maybe I'll put the links in the show notes here so that people can go read them themselves. There was one position by, I believe, Rabbi Joel Roth, who said, yes, there are gay people in our community, and Leviticus 18:22 exists, and as much as it breaks my heart, I can't endorse things like rabbis performing marriages between same-sex couples or ordaining rabbis who are openly gay, because it says, it's 18:22, it says, a man shall not lie with a man. And let me back up a second and just make it super clear. In my estimation, Judaism isn't against being gay. To just get real nitty gritty, it's against doing gay. Like, it's not about who somebody is as an individual. It's about the particular intimate act between 2 people of the same sex. And Leviticus 18:22 only talks about men. Later, there developed an additional layer of halakhic literature saying women neither, right? It said, I know it just says men. And one could say that for a while it was sort of permissive about lesbians and saying, okay, this is just about men, women can do their own thing. But then additional people kind of applied their prejudice to this and says, well, if we're not doing men, let's not do women either. That's how they used to do things in Egypt, and we're not, we don't want to do Egyptian stuff. And so it became a blanket prohibition on any sort of homosexual activity and any sort of public acceptance of people who are public about it. And that means you can't become a rabbi, you can't be a leader in a community. People might say a synagogue can't employ somebody like that. And so what Rabbi Roth was saying is that, yes, this is painful, this breaks my heart, and yet I can't say that this doesn't exist in the Torah. And so we're going to just advocate for no change at this point. And if you're a scholar of Rabbi Roth's work and you want to challenge me on this, please do. I'm sure I could be educated about this, but that was my read of that tshuva. There was another tshuva by, I want to say Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who said, look, yes, it's in the Torah. However, there's a lot of stuff in the Torah that has, let's say, fallen into desuetude in current practice because it is abominable. Right? There's also a thing in the Torah that says if your son is rebellious, then you should take him to the public square and stone him to death. And there's a discussion of that in the Talmud that says, whoever did this, like this is horrible. Like I can't imagine as a parent doing that. I can imagine as a parent of former teenagers, the temptation to, really punish your kid who is really being difficult. But I can't imagine taking a child out to the public square and taking her or his life. And even the rabbis in the Talmud said, did that ever happen? And some of them said, no, I think they just put that in there. I think God just actually put that verse in there so that we would gain merit from studying it and being disgusted by it. Right? This was a test of sorts. And so they said nobody ever really did this, but it's there. That doesn't mean that we legit have stonings of our teenagers in the public square. So forget about it. Or rather, what they said was they applied such strict rules to seeing that through that it would never happen. In the same way that the Sanhedrin didn't abrogate the death penalty in the Torah in the sense that it said all those things that said you could get killed for, you can't get killed for it anymore. What they did was they made the rules of evidence so strict on capital cases that they effectively eliminated the death penalty in Jewish law, right? And so I don't know if this was Rabbi Tucker's exact argument, but he says this rule that we have is hurting people, right? It's causing discrimination. It's excluding members from our communities who are really seeking connection to God and with other Jews. And we've let stuff go before, and I think it's time to let this go as well. So the third tshuva on this issue, I want to say by Rabbis Dorf, Nevins, and Reisner, had sort of a synthesis or a third way, if you will. And their position was, yes, we have Leviticus 18:22 that says a man shall not lie with another man as a man does with a woman. But we also have this thing from Genesis that says we are all created in the image of God. And we derive from that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity as a walking image of the living God. And the fact is, sometimes in Jewish law, one mitzvah supersedes another mitzvah, right? A popular example, at least popular in my crowd, is pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat. This is a legal principle that says to save a life, you can break Shabbat rules. You shouldn't go around breaking Shabbat rules for no reason, but if somebody's life is at risk, then you can. An example given is, if there's a building on fire, and it's not, generally speaking, we don't put out fires on Shabbat. And so if a building catches fire, you kind of got to let it burn. However, if there are people in the building who can't get out unless you extinguish the fire. Or if the adjoining building is going to catch fire and has people in it, put that fire out. I know it's against the rules for Shabbat, but pikuach nefesh, or saving a life, supersedes just about every mitzvah in the Torah, except for some rare exceptions to that. And so all the time we have competing mitzvot. Saving a life supersedes Shabbat. And the argument of Rabbis Dorf, Nevins, and Reisner was that treating a human being with dignity for how they were born in the image of the living God supersedes our inclination to discriminate against people who might be in, let's say, violation of Exodus, who might be in violation of Leviticus 18:22. And what I like about this one, and this is the position that I agree with and take, is that first off, it doesn't just say, well, Torah says that we're going to do it, because that's not always how we do Judaism. And on the other hand, there's a position that says, well, this one doesn't work anymore, so let's let go of it, because that's not always how we do Judaism either. What this third tshuva says is, yes, we have these two values, and we acknowledge the reality that sometimes one value supersedes another. And that both preserves the law and preserves the integrity of the legal process, right? It doesn't just say, I'm not going to do the stuff I disagree with. But it also acknowledges the reality that sometimes we get to make decisions between two things that are strong values for us, and that is a very Jewish legal thing to do. And so we are going to let human dignity supersede our enforcement of this other thing. And so that's the position that I've taken. And I'll give you a little more insight into how I feel about this issue and that particular interpretation of 1822 here in a second. I want to go to the chat to see. This is... so somebody in the chat's kind of picking a fight and characterizing gay people, so I'm not going to dignify that with a response. There's not really a question being asked, just this statement's being made. And so I'll let that go for a second. And I'm going to get back to my take on, and this is, I want to acknowledge, like, everybody can share their opinions here. That's okay with me. But if people are making broad characterizations, that's not something I want to repeat. So I want to get back to my particular interpretation of Leviticus 18:22. So setting aside for a moment the fact that respect for human dignity supersedes our enforcement or legislation around 1822. I want to take a look at 1822 in its own context and address it by itself. Now, Leviticus chapter 18, it largely deals with, let's say, forbidden sexual activity, and it gives a whole list of relationships that should not be consummated. I'll say it that way. It just lists, here's 2 types of people or 3 types of people that should not have sex with each other. And so we're not going to permit or endorse that in our community. And things like a father should not sleep with his daughter. Things like a man should not sleep with with one woman and her sister simultaneously. Things like a man should not have, and first off, it's always talking to men, for one thing. It says, okay, these are things that are forbidden for a man to do. Set that aside for a second. And on that list, it's like, okay, no incest, no bestiality, right? No, a man should not have sex with an animal. It says a man should not have sex with his mother or his stepmother. And I know this is getting a little bit adult, but hopefully everybody here can deal with that. When you take a look, and in there also is a man should not have sex with a man as he does with another woman. First off, you can interpret that and say, well, that's not how it works anyway. Right? There's, as a woman, that 2 men have sex in a different way. The rabbi, just to be very clear on it, the rabbis have taken a look at that. The sages of our tradition have interpreted that as anal intercourse between 2 men. And so, and anal intercourse itself isn't necessarily prohibited between, let's say, a man and a woman in rabbinic law. But if you take this in context and say, okay, as a category of all these different things that we're not supposed to do, what do these things have in common with each other? And there are a few things that they have in common. One is largely about consent, right? A man should not have sex with a child who is in that man's care because that child cannot consent to that behavior. An animal cannot consent to that behavior. And this is where there's a little bit of historical insight that I gained recently. Often, another man cannot give consent in this context. There was a great book that I recommend to everybody. It's super long, so it's hard to get. It was a little bit difficult for me to read through. I actually listened to it as a book on tape, but I've listened to it twice because it's really powerful, not just about this issue, but it touches on this issue. It's by a guy named David Graeber, wrote a great book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And he talks about debt and the development of modern economies and all sorts of historical events. One thing he addresses is the economic institution of slavery. And in his estimation, when we think about slavery in the United States today, we think about Africans being kidnapped and brought to this country to be slaves. Sometimes when we read about in the Torah, we hear about people being captured in war and becoming slaves. But what Graeber points out is that most of slavery throughout the history of the institution of slavery was not this kind of conquest slavery. It was debt slavery, right? If you had a bad year in your crops and your crops failed and you needed to borrow money in order to buy more seed to plant crops for another year or just get through until the next season, what often happened is that a member of your household would go into indentured servitude to the person that you borrowed money from. And I want to separate slavery as we think about it of like lifelong slavery from indentured servitude, which when you look at the various things in the Torah about how Hebrew slaves are treated or how non-Hebrew slaves are treated, a lot of that fits in the category of indentured servitude. But most slavery throughout the history of slavery has been this kind of debt slavery. And part of the history of debt slavery is that male householders who had debt slaves or indentured servants in their care would take liberties with the male servants that they had in their house as somebody who kind of belonged to them or was in their control, right? And this was just something that they did. They took advantage of that situation. And so one might imagine that in biblical times, when it's talks an awful lot about how to be around slaves and how to take care of them and what rights they have and what liberties they have. I think the point that the Torah was making in the context of a number of other verses that says you should not take advantage of your position of power to have non-consensual sex with another individual or animal. This fits into that category. Like just because you have a slave doesn't mean you get to have sex with him. And I think that was, and you see a number of examples in the Torah of a kind of increased humaneness toward people under our control, right? We didn't abolish slavery in the Torah, unfortunately, because that was just a part of the human economy back then. Unfortunately, it still is. We didn't abolish animal sacrifice either. We just modified it so that later we could get rid of it. In this case, we modified slavery in a number of different ways, gave slaves certain rights and privileges, and had to let them go after a certain period of time. That's what the Shemitah and that's what the Yovel Jubilee was all about. We couldn't get rid of it entirely, but we modified it in a way that it would be less degrading. And I think that's what Leviticus 18:22 was trying to accomplish. I'm going to say that don't have to go on a very long limb here to say that a lot of rabbis don't agree with me about this point. This is the stand that I am taking. And I do that to let my students know where I'm coming from. I don't think, in the words of Indigo Montoya, speaking to the Sicilian in The Princess Bride, when you look at 1822, I do not think it means what you think it means. Furthermore, in any case where we would use that verse to discriminate against somebody, to shame someone, to exclude someone from our community, that is superseded by the commandment from Genesis to treat every human being as if he or she or beyond were created in the image of God. And so it's just was important to me to let you know that about me in case you want to study with me or not in the future. So let's jump into the chat. We have Omed Chazak 613 joining us today. Let's see. We have some people who are multitasking. As Omed Chazak says, slavery can be a topic in and of itself. Certainly, that's not necessarily what this talk is about, but I wanted to acknowledge the reality of the situation and the time and place and the context of this verse that has had so much fuss made about it. Let's see. Did you mention the response of Rabbis Myron Geller, Robert Fine, and David Fine? I did not mention that response. I'm most familiar with the Roth Tshuva, the Tucker Tshuva, and the Dorf Nevins Reisner Tshuva, but thank you for bringing that up. I'll have to look into that. And so listen, whatever questions, I don't know if I've superseded any questions here by my answer, but whatever questions you have, I'm happy to hang out and answer those questions. This is a thing that I get a lot. I ask people, I'm a part of some Facebook groups where people are on the process to converting or have converted, and these are kind of private support groups, and people ask, like, what has been your experience as a gay person entering a Jewish community as a convert, right, or as not a convert? So you're already different insofar as you are a convert, even though in Jewish law you are not different from any Jew at all. But people perceive that difference in status or treatment, and that's a reality on the ground there. But let's say you've got that perceived difference as well as being gay in a community that for most of its history has really frowned upon that sort of thing. That's a double whammy. And I know that can be a hard thing to go through. That's not something I've had to go through, and so I can't speak to that experience. But I encourage you to own your Jewishness as much as you own the rest of your identity and show up as a Jew. And God willing, people will accept you for that. And if they don't, let's do what we can to educate them or find the community that's right for you. So again, I have to caveat all this. This is not part of my lived experience. This is just my legal opinion based on my study of the law of people that I know who have gone through troubles integrating into a Jewish community. And it's my pledge to get some more guests on this podcast who can speak to this directly. Let's see. Just take a pause here to read a great comment. The word they use is called a mute. So this is CJ, I think, speaking to the Geller, Fine, and Fine responsum. The word they use is called a miyut in terms of excluding the Torah prohibitions, saying that our modern understanding and the fact that we have LGBT couples in loving relationships make it necessary. This is an important point, I think, both by this tshuva. I believe the Dorf Nevins Reisner tshuva discusses this as well. And that is, if we don't accept, like God forbid, we exclude couples who are in a loving, committed relationship from our midst just because we don't agree with the nature of that relationship. Many rabbis have looked at this and said, well, if we don't embrace this couple as a couple, what we're effectively doing is pushing these relationships underground and discouraging people from being in committed relationships, let's say. I mean, it's kind of presumptuous of me to say that, but the idea is that, and I'll just speak for myself, I will do a wedding ceremony for any two Jews who I think are good for each other, right? I won't say any two Jews because, sometimes I meet couples and I'm like, I've never kicked out a couple because I thought they were mean to each other. I haven't done that many weddings, and luckily everyone seemed just perfect for each other. No divorces yet that I know of, but in weddings that I've done. Several kids have been born, thank God, in weddings that I've done. But the thing is, I won't endorse marrying a couple of two Jews who don't seem right for each other. However, and just to be clear, I don't at this point I don't do weddings between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person. I do not judge people in those kinds of relationships because for many years I was in one of those relationships, and had I not been, I wouldn't be Jewish today. So just putting that on the table. But any two Jews who are right for each other, I think we can marry them, and that's the best way for a couple to be, is in a loving, committed relationship. And so Judaism, outside of the kind of prohibitions we've been talking about, is actually a very sex-positive religion in the sense that Basically, it doesn't say, okay, there's only one kind of position you could do. And by the way, that whole hole in the sheet thing is a complete myth. I won't explain it right now, but if you still think that religious Jews have sex through a hole in the sheet, that doesn't happen. I can explain why some other time. But anything that a loving, committed couple wants to do with full consent by both parties, by the way. Again, a lot of Leviticus 18 is about situations where consent is legally impossible. Whatever a couple wants to do and agrees to do, game on. And, unless it's something that's just degrading to one of them, or it's in public or something like that, it's immodest. But anything that two people want to do, they can do, as long as it is in service to, let's say, tightening a loving, committed relationship. And so those are some things that are very important in Judaism: is consent in sexual behavior, and not being non-degrading, but also supporting people who want to be together and have the community support their union. And so I think that's the basis by which many rabbis have said, it used to be not a kind of wedding that we did. The Reform movement has been doing it for much longer than we have. The conservative movement has been doing it kind of publicly since the mid-2000s. And for this reason, that we would, and not every rabbi agrees with me, or every conservative rabbi does this, but we see two people who love each other and want to make a lifelong commitment. How can we not support that as rabbis, and encourage our communities to support that as well? So Omad Chazak says, my shul is a very accepting place of LGBTQ people. We are a safe place. So CJ asks, can I share a link to their PDF from the Rabbinical Assembly? Absolutely. Share whatever. I don't know. Sometimes YouTube gets weird about sharing links in the chat. If it pops up and I can approve it, I will. But go ahead and share that, or share it in the comments, and I'll check the filter later and make sure it gets shared. I'm all about teaching Torah, not hiding Torah. So this has been a really, this has been a really great talk. I'm going to admit I was a little bit nervous about it, not because the topic makes me nervous, but the fact that this is not part of my lived experience personally makes me feel like less of a teacher on this. So I want to bring some other teachers to bear as soon as I can. But I also wanted you to know what I know from Jewish law that embraces all kinds of Jews in the community, endorses committed relationships of all kinds, and just share my personal feelings about it as a Jew, as a human being, as a rabbi, on all of those different levels, so that you know where I'm coming from. I hope this has been helpful for people. If you have other questions, if you're catching this on the replay and you didn't make the chat, whatever questions or comments you have, feel free to throw them into the comments below this video. And let's say I opened this with some podcasty kind of chatter, so I'll close it with some podcasty chatter. And I've got to record a couple of other things as well. First off, I got to go back and say, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey. Thank you, live studio audience. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. If this is your first time listening to this show, I highly suggest that you subscribe. That way, every show that comes out, you will get automatically downloaded to your phone or podcast listening device, and you'll have access to the whole archive of the 30 or so shows that we've done so far. If you want to see some additional resources on this episode, go to jewcurious.show/episode 36. That's the word episode, the number 36. Today we're going to be talking about people who identify as LGBTQIA and folks, and their status in the Jewish community. People have had different experiences about this. People have had different opinions about this. And today my goal is to share with you my personal opinion from the law that I have studied, with the caveat that I don't identify as part of this community, so I can't share a lived experience of being a gay person in a Jewish community, but I can share some experience of some students that I've had and my read of Jewish law and tradition in proper context that informs that, so that you know, hero, where I am coming from. I may lose subscribers, I may not, but it's important that you know where I'm coming from if we're going to learn together. All right, now we're going to do the outro. Thank you for being a live studio audience and playing along with this stuff. Let me just make sure I approve this link that CJ Mays has shared. Thank you for that. And now we're going to wrap this up. Hero, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Jew Curious Show podcast. It has been my great honor to learn from you and learn with you. Thank you, live studio audience, for giving some great comments and asking some great questions. This is why I love to do it live and to share it on the podcast. I'll say one more time, if you would like links to resources that we have mentioned, check out the show notes to this episode at jewcurious.show/episode 36. That's the word episode, the numeral 36. And I want to ask one last favor, if I can. If you have enjoyed this podcast or gotten anything valuable out of it at all, do me a solid and give us a review on iTunes. Go to iTunes, type in Jew Curious. There's only one show that sounds like that. Pretty sure about that at this point. And leave us the appropriate number of stars, and if you would, a few words of your honest opinion about this show. iTunes uses these star ratings and reviews to decide who else to recommend this podcast to. So if you've gotten anything out of it, by leaving a review, you can help other Jew-curious people just like you get something out of it as well. And if you'll take this step from a hero, I would, as we say in the Republic of Texas, I'd be much obliged. Thank you for doing this, and everybody who's watching live, hang out for a little bit. I just want to make the closer for the recording, and then I'll stay and answer whatever questions people have. And I just got one last thing to say to you today. Peace. Whew. Boy, that was really something for a live studio recording. I'm going to say, I don't know if I look kind of shiny. I forgot to turn my air conditioner on before the show, but I really appreciate everybody chiming in for this, sharing your opinions, having, I'm going to say, honest and not necessarily easy conversations in the chat. Thank you for sticking up for each other. I don't want to shut down people who have different opinions than mine. Absolutely not. I just didn't want to dignify particular comments by sharing them out loud. But I want to just congratulate you on handling those conversations with care and compassion and dignity. And I'm going to take all these links and things from the various chuvot that I talked about, including the Geller Fine and Fine thing that CJ Mays is sharing, and throw those both in the show notes of the podcast, as well as, if I remember, I hope I do, the description of the video after we get off this live thing. So this is one of the great joys in my rabbinic life right now, is doing these live sessions. So if anybody's here for the first time, welcome. You are welcome back anytime. You can always check my channel for upcoming live conversations that we're having. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., we're going to be talking about the Parashat HaShavua, the Parsha of the week, which is Vayikra. We are into the book of Leviticus. We are going to be talking a lot about purity and impurity and killing animals to worship God. We'll talk. That might be kind of weird, but we'll talk about it. This book also contains Leviticus 18 that we talked about. More importantly, it contains Leviticus 19, the holiness code, where we get from, the do's and don'ts of sexuality into how do we be a holy people. God says, "You shall be holy, for I, your God, am holy," and then gives us a bunch of ethical standards by which to live that have nothing to do with relationships in the bedroom, but more how we treat each other in more general ways. And so be excited to talk about that. We're going to get into the particulars of the sacrifices, which might seem kind of gory, but teaches us a lot about the equality, I'll say, the equality of the rich and the poor when it comes to holy service. So if you're interested in that topic, come to the live chat tomorrow and we'll talk about that. And until next time, heroes, peace.